Hello, everyone from Knowledge E. My name is Sam, and we are super excited to be launching our new initiative, Knowledge E Speaks, Discussions Towards a More Knowledgeable World. I'm here with my colleagues today to talk about peer review. Before we get started with all of our juicy questions, I would love to ask you, Emily, our head of publishing, why have we chosen peer review as our inaugural topic to start off our discussions?
Peer review is vitally important to the entire scholarly ecosystem. And recently, well, not that recently, a few years ago, Peer Review Week was launched as a global initiative to spread awareness about peer review. And we're particularly thrilled that this year we're involved in the steering committee for this global initiative, which is focusing on identity and seeking to promote diversity and equality in peer review processes and practices around the world. So we thought this would be a really great chance for us to kickstart Knowledge E Speaks.
Absolutely. That's great, Emily. Thank you. So let's dive right in. I've got my first question, which is, what are the advantages of peer review for the scientific community and for the researcher or author?
Well, I'll start, given I was already talking. So just to let our listeners know, I come at this from two angles, both as, well, maybe even three, both as head of publishing. So we have a sort of professional corporate responsibility to ensure research is as good as it possibly can be. I'm involved in the publication of a literature journal. And again, peer review is a really vital resource for journals to evaluate the quality of the research being submitted, because even if you're a specialist in the broader field, such as romanticism, you might not know the ins and outs of a specific poet or a specific topic. So you really need the reviewers who are able to do a deep dive into that research area and give you valuable information. And finally, as an author, I have to say peer review is incredibly valuable. Every time I get peer review, it gives me so many fresh insights. Sometimes I have to rewrite an article from scratch to get all those insights in, but it's just incredibly valuable. And I really, really appreciate anytime someone gives me those fresh insights.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'll jump in too. So I'm also an editor of a journal like Emily is. So Emily's journal is humanities, mine is social science. And it actually, as I was thinking about the question, it occurred to me that there are sometimes differences around the value of peer review in the different sort of areas of humanities, social science, and the physical sciences, physical and mathematical sciences. In overall, the general value is to ensure the credibility of the research that's being published. But in some cases, it makes a difference where in the physical sciences and often in the hard social sciences, really having other scholars ensure that the research being described is methodologically valid and reliable, so that the only way that science sort of progresses is to make sure that we're doing it in a systematic scientific way, right? And that's science anyway. And it is systematic in the humanities also, but just in a slightly different way. The other thing that I also want to highlight about peer review. So it's outstanding for the author because it just, and as an editor, it makes for better papers. So without peer review, sometimes there's papers I receive that I can see that the research is really good, but the writing is, they're not communicating. Like the writing is getting in the way of being able to actually understand how valuable the research is. But the third thing also about peer review, which is that oftentimes peer review, as well as with the editors, allows the paper to focus on scope. And the reason I mention that is my journal is library and information science research, is specifically focused on methods and theories. And a lot of times we get papers that are about the findings, and they need to be more rigorous in the way they present the methods and theories. So depending on the scope of the journal, part of the peer review combined with editor process helps that happen.
Great. Wow, that was a really good, robust answer to that first question. Thanks, ladies, for really diving in. Okay, so we talked.
There's just one thing that I wanted to add. Yeah, sorry. I think one of the elements that we can really summarize is the validation of an article. So really what the peer review process does, in addition to the quality, ensuring the quality matches, is to is a validation of the methods, of the whole integrity of the article that has been submitted. And still really peer review is one of the widely most accepted ways of really evaluating that. So I would just like to highlight validation.
Absolutely.
Can I just follow on that, just to say that also the reverse of that is partly to make sure that what's being published out there, that we're getting good stuff and we're keeping some of the not so good stuff out of the mix.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Karin. And that's actually a very good segue to my next question. So we've talked a little bit about the value of peer review, but what's the flip side? What are the drawbacks of peer review?
If I can jump in first.
Please.
I think one of the perceived drawbacks, this might be specific to my field, so in humanities, but I think it's often more broad, because I know it is also very much in students' sciences as well, is rightly or wrongly, there is a perception that peer reviewers are very harsh, that they're unnecessarily cruel, and that can sometimes be the case with poorly done peer reviews. You know, people can just go, this is very bad, it's not fit for publication, or one of my personal favorites that happens to so many people is the reviewer, particularly sometimes more established scholars, who still think that they are their work is the seminal text and don't always agree with subsequent developments, can be very dogmatic in anything that develops upon their own work in perhaps a less than effusive light and a little more negative. They can be very reactionary and reject peer review. There's a sort of a standard joke in my field about peer reviewer 2. When you have 2 reviewers, peer reviewer 1 is always lovely and says, oh, I like this argument, and oh, I really like the way you've written this, and I really like the way you've brought this in. And peer reviewer 2 will come through, and it is always peer reviewer 2, and attack the specific things that peer reviewer 1 likes. And I think that leads into the second issue sometimes, which is part of the role of a good editor is very much to take the peer review content and frame it in such a way that it still remains constructive and useful for the author. But equally, the flip side of that is, unless the editor specifically says, focus on peer reviewer 1, not peer reviewer 2, one of the difficulties if you do have 2 reviewers is that I have an article that I'm working on the final revisions now, and I am very much in this scenario where peer reviewer 1 has said do A, B, and C, and peer reviewer 2 has given me completely opposing information, and the editor hasn't given you input. So I, as the author, am now sitting there going, okay, I have one more chance because it was review and resubmit, and this is my final chance. I have to choose the right parts of each review to get my article accepted, but I don't know which ones are going to win, as it were. So I think sometimes with the conflicting advice and harsh critiques, those are probably 2 of the biggest drawbacks that I can think of, though I'm sure everyone else has others to chip in.
Great description, Emily. I think we both take our roles as editors, particularly around that issue, very seriously, and it involves more work as an editor, but I think it enables us to generate better quality papers and better experiences for the authors. When you say sort of what are the drawbacks of peer review, I want to go sort of out to the 30,000-foot view in terms of the way the whole peer review system works, to just mention a couple of challenges. My journal in particular, we just had an editorial in our last issue talking about, well, the title was, where have all the peer reviewers gone? I mean, we have really had an incredibly difficult time in the past 18 months. It's taken us much, much longer to actually find peer reviewers. So, you know, we oftentimes have to contact 10 or even a dozen or more people and ask them to peer review, and they say no, and we have to keep going on to find other people, which is challenging. And so the fact that leads to other issues I think we'll talk about in terms of how you actually get peer reviews to happen. But the other process is, once you have peer reviews, you also, depending on your work, it can be hard to find peer reviewers that are appropriate. So specifically for interdisciplinary work, which I am very interested in and have done a lot of, when it's something is interdisciplinary and you have multiple disciplines, it's very difficult to find people, because they can review a paper from the perspective of their discipline. But if they're not used to doing interdisciplinary work, they'll say, well, the other part of it doesn't make any sense because it's not something they're familiar with. And so that integration, it can be really challenging, especially if it's something that's really new and really cutting edge. So that's a challenge, I think.
Yeah, in addition to the challenges from the journal side and really finding the reviewers, which not just the reviewers, also the appropriate reviewers. I think from the author side, especially early career researchers where they're just starting to publish, you know, that feedback that they receive, the way the feedback is received is very, very important. And it could really like discourage or encourage further research or further authorship. So I think that quality and the type of reviews received can sometimes be very, very daunting. So I think it's not a downside of the system. Of course, any system can improve its quality and improve, but it's just in the ways things are done that these improvements can be made.
I agree so much. What you were saying about as an early career researcher, I had finished my PhD and decided to leave academia largely because I'd never had a non-institutional job and thought it was time to step into the waters and see. Obviously, I slightly miss academia now, but I missed it so much at the time that after a year, I did write my first article and I submitted it. And the whole reason I'm still working on the fringes of academia as an independent scholar now is completely because of the really positive peer review that I got back from that very first article that gave me the confidence to carry on contributing new research and new scholarship, even though I'm not a professional academic. And I think it's so true. But I think it's so important. It's something we tell all of our editors within Knowledge, all the journals we publish. We have a set of guidelines for them to help peer reviewers. And one of the most prominent points on there is to always be courteous, always be polite, and always try and frame criticism constructively rather than negatively. I think it's probably the single most important skill of a peer reviewer.
Absolutely.
I think if I could add one more sort of major drawback, which is often brought up, is the idea of peer review, the whole process taking a long time. And again, that's something which is one of those things that's kind of down to, like, it's not intrinsic of the actual process itself. It can be about how the whole process is organized and it can be improved upon. But certainly if the process takes a long time, that can be very frustrating for the authors. And it can mean that, you know, especially if they're having to submit to many different journals before they get accepted, it can be a very long, drawn out process. And particularly, I mean, I come more from the public health and health sciences side. And, you know, a lot of that information, it's time sensitive. Like if you wait 2 or 3 years for your results to come out, they may not be relevant. The classic example being the research on COVID-19 that has been coming out. People who are publishing that research can't wait for 2 years for that information to be published. So that's something which definitely is a challenge that is one of those key things that needs to be kind of considered and worked on.
Yeah, that was a great point that you raised, and especially on the COVID-19 situation. I definitely heard of many publishers who tried to speed up the publishing process and to really make sure that this cutting edge research and relevant and important research comes out as soon as possible. So that's a really good point that you're mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone said things that struck a chord because, you know, as soon as you said it, everyone was nodding their heads. Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. I think we've obviously identified a lot of drawbacks, and each of you kind of alluded to some different situations in which publishers and reviewers can work together to kind of mitigate these drawbacks or to respond to them. I think, Emily, you referred to maybe giving guidance as a publisher to your peer reviewers. You talked about the tone of the feedback that you review. I think, Abby, you talked about publishers speeding up their processes in order to try to get this information out. Is there anything else that comes to anyone's mind about ways that publishers and reviewers can work together to overcome these drawbacks?
I think, sorry, Karen, you start.
Well, actually, go ahead, because actually I was going to talk about it from a different angle.
I was just going to say, I think actually initiatives like Peer Review Week are really important to this whole concept of improving the processes, improving the understanding of what peer review is currently, how we could improve it, how it should be, processes, practices. I think, like I said, I think general awareness initiatives like this are incredibly important, just across the board, really.
And actually, then we're really is on the same track, because what I was going to say is the question was about what can publishers and reviewers do, and Emily talked a little bit broader about awareness, and I would like to talk about two other stakeholders in this process. One is professional and academic associations, and I think that there's an opportunity for these associations to advocate on a regular basis that peer review is part of service to their profession, and that to try and actually, and the other stakeholder is educational institutions. And we teach people in going through their master's and PhD programs, particularly even PhD programs, there's not a course in how to do peer review. So a lot of people don't know, they don't know that it's something they should be doing to contribute to their field. If you get published, for every article you get published, you should be doing at least a couple peer reviews, because it's your way of giving back, and it's only fair, right? It's only fair. And so I think professional associations and universities that teach researchers and provide the room for researchers, so research institutions as well, need to also take responsibility for encouraging this service to the profession.
Yeah, and just to add, as we mentioned at the beginning, it's still the most widely accepted way of validating articles when they are submitted. So the process is there, but the question is how we can improve that process. And like everything else, things, various trends can evolve. And for example, in peer review, we are seeing the rise of open peer review, where it, for example, overcomes some of these challenges, where reviewers, once the review is open and everyone can read it, sometimes take more consideration into what is written and the way it's written, and that feedback is open, and that feedback can be transferred to the next journal, for example. So I think there are various trends that are happening. There's the possibility to volunteer as a peer review for various journals. I don't know if I think they call it volunteer. So you can actually volunteer for being a peer reviewer for a specific journal, and that sort of shortens that process of having to find and look for valid peer reviewers. So I think trends within the process itself and improvements and innovation would always help the process get better.
If I could add,
everybody has a point.
Because they're building on what both Karen and Cameron said, I think one of the initiatives that's great about this to really encourage the engagement of researchers in the peer review processes is things like Publons that do give credit to the peer reviewer, and some initiatives are now allowing DOIs to be attached to peer review if you're doing a fully transparent peer review. So you're getting real academic credit and credibility as the peer reviewer, as well as giving that credibility to the articles you are reviewing. And I think that's a really valuable way of encouraging everyone to invest more wholeheartedly in the system.
Yeah, that makes heaps of sense, Emily. I want to, if you guys don't mind, I want to circle back and kind of dig deeper into a point that we've kind of made throughout this conversation, which is the fact that peer review can either be really motivating to researchers or sometimes demotivating to researchers. And I think all of us really had a visceral response when Cameron said that. So I want to take just a minute to dive a little deeper. Could you give me your ideas about what actually are the qualities of valuable feedback?
Can I just jump in? I'm gonna, because I feel like really strongly about this. Emily already mentioned a few things, which are particularly being constructive, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's very common that a reviewer will say, well, this doesn't work or that doesn't work, but being able to provide constructive feedback is not only allows you to be more polite, but also actually helps make the paper better. And so if a peer reviewer is only coming from the perspective of like, is it any good or no good, then that's not helpful, because sometimes it can be made better. My other, in the guidelines that editors can provide to peer reviewers, and as well as being peer reviewers being trained, I think one of the most, the key, so there's some key factors is being constructive, but also being specific. And when I say being specific, I mean that there are many different types of aspects that come into peer review. So one is the validation of the research and the methods for sure. But another piece is style, like communication style, but also, as I mentioned before, like the scope of the journal and making sure that the article is being written in a way that's relevant for that journal and that culture of that discipline or whatever. And because you have lots of different types of research, right? So there's research that's really focused on world problems, like the research is intended to actually help solve a problem in the world. There's research that's really focused on knowledge expansion, and that it's really much more technical about the discipline, whether it's the methods, the theories, or generating more data for that. And so I think, and its usefulness to that audience, depending on what the research is organized about, it's important to actually keep that separate. And so we're talking about the methods, validating the methods, and whether it's good research, the style of the communication to make sure it can be useful, but also the interpretation of the results. You can do really good research and have really good findings, and then if you don't talk about why those findings matter, or if you make interpretations and create meaning out of the findings that isn't really relevant or right, that's a different thing. And when, as an author, to understand and receive feedback that keeps those things separate and specific is also extremely useful, because some of the feedback that you would get from my journal, which is focused on methods, and then you think, well, maybe my article isn't that good. But it's like, actually, if you're just reporting findings and making technical advances in the field and providing more data, totally great. It's just not for my journal. And so making those specific comments can really help.
Yeah, sorry, you go.
Sorry, a few things. First of all, I think building on that idea of having very kind of specific and constructive feedback, I think also being very clear about, so if you make a particular criticism or ask a question, why that's important, why you're bringing that up, because sometimes the author might just look at what you're saying and just really not be confused about why that might be an issue, or why they should be writing more about that or explaining it. Another thing I think is it's very important for you to be very clear as well in your reviewer comments in terms of even just the basics of maybe numbering the comments or putting them in some kind of organized way so it's easy for the author to respond to them, maybe even organizing them into major points and minor points so they know which ones are the most important ones to prioritize and focus on, just to make it as easy as possible for the author to actually go through and respond. And the last thing I wanted to point out also was it's good as a reviewer to approach the process with as open a mind as they possibly can, to be open to the idea that maybe this paper will approach the research topic in a new way or use different methods, which even if you're an expert in the field, you may not have used, or using a different perspective, basically being open to the idea that perhaps you could learn something from this research, that even if they ask different questions or maybe make bold new points that are quite counter to the current assumptions and current ways of thinking, not to automatically discredit that and criticize it, but actually to be open to those ideas.
Outstanding point, Abby. I mean, really, when you look back into science and the history of science, science doesn't get advanced by doing the same thing we always did, right? It only gets advanced by stuff that's revolutionary, to quote Thomas Kuhn and Bruno Latour, right? Like you have to be willing to push the limits and allow that to happen. Excellent point, Abby.
I think also, particularly if you're developing into a new field, or even if you're working on something established but moving it in a new area, or maybe adapting an existing methodology to your field that's taken from another field, you might sometimes, your field really well, or your methodology really well, but you might not know the new field or the new methodology so much. And I think that's, again, where peer reviewers can be incredibly valuable, because they might be a specialist in the newer area where you are, and just bring up a little extra, because I'm sure we'd all like to be specialists in absolutely everything, but it's never going to happen. So for example, I recently submitted an article comparing the poet in my field of expertise with a French author, and I know some about the French author, but not enough. And the peer review was incredibly helpful, giving me a more expanded reading list to just double check a few points. Admittedly, it took a while to ship them out to Dubai, but they just arrived today, so I'm very excited about reading them. But again, it takes a lifetime to be a specialist in your field, and peer review gives you a chance to get that extra input and the extra expertise from someone who's spent a lifetime in a different field. And it's just incredibly valuable, that level of specificity, I think.
Yeah. And I think, Emily, just to follow up on that, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing, it really underpins this idea about this open-mindedness, the idea that peer review is a service to the academic community, because in theory, right, if somebody was reviewing that article and just said, no, you don't know enough about that French author, you don't know what you're talking about, versus I recommend that you read book A, B, C, and D, and this is going to give you more insights. That's very encouraging. That's saying, hey, you're almost there, and I have some really good references for you to take a look at. And then that essentially creates an article that is better than it would have been before, and it encourages you to continue your research. Is that a fair statement for me to make?
It's a completely fair statement, and also it's that what you've just said also again really stresses the fact that peer review is itself part of the scholarly discussion and debate. It's not a standalone thing, not least because when you're writing an article, you get really down into it. And I'm sure we've all, even when we've written, emails or anything, even to the level of you can read something a million times and your eyes glaze over the errors, even just down to basic typos. But there are typo equivalents on a structural scale with almost any article when you first write it, or even in its 100th iteration, and a completely fresh set of eyes comes in and evaluates it and says, okay, I really like what you've done here. I'm not convinced about this. You need to really convince me. You're not convincing me yet. But also what you've done here, I think really relates to this. Have you considered that? And I will then respond and send it back. And it's such a valuable discussion, which is why I think it's great now that people are increasingly getting credit for that contribution.
Yeah. It's called peer review. It's not like someone above or below providing feedback. It's like your peers, and it's like it's supposed to be constructive and really move towards the advancement of sciences.
Particularly right now, where we don't, in a sort of still sadly not quite yet post-COVID world, we don't get the face-to-face interactions that we used to have at conferences to discuss our research. So peer review is, I think, even more important right now than before, because a lot of authors and academics are missing out on that day-to-day engagement with their peers. And as you say, Cameron, it is peer review. This is, right now, for a lot of us, is all we've got.
But I think that that's really important in terms of to circle. And so I want to circle back to one of the things Cameron was mentioning before, and also you guys mentioned too, about like these new trends in more open or transparent peer review, ways of people getting credit, because it actually, not only does it allow peer reviewers, it encourages them more because they can get credit, but it actually creates this broader environment where it is sort of collective science. And we come from this, very many of us anyway, this individualistic view that I'm going to be like this super researcher, but science as a whole is a collective effort, as you guys were all saying. And so I actually do want to go sideways on some of those trends, but I don't know if you have a question about that. I think you have a question about that, right, Sam? Can I just go on like openness and transparency?
Go for it, Karen.
Okay, so I think it's fantastic, these trends towards being able to recognize peer reviewers for their reviews, but also the openness of being able to publish the actual reviews next to the articles, because some peer reviewers provide really incredibly outstanding examples of review. And not only do I want them to get credit, but making those public means that even though those reviews are specific to a specific article, they oftentimes have those symptoms of good quality feedback that apply to many articles. And I want more people to be able to see all of that stuff, right? Because I think it will help all of us. But there are challenges. Yes.
Karen, can I do a timeout and ask you an important question? Can you make a distinction between the difference between a blind review versus a transparent? Because I think we're talking about something really juicy, and it's important to make sure everyone in the audience understands the difference between the two, because you're talking about transparent, correct?
Well, okay, so there's transparent and there's open, and then there's single blind and double blind. So let me start with blind, which the idea behind the blind review is that the reviewer doesn't know the name of the author, and the author doesn't know the name of the reviewer. Is a double blind situation, right? So they don't know each other. And the value of that is that you don't get extra subjective elements like, you know, oh, I recognize that author, they're super famous. And you, whether you intend it or not, you're either going to be more harsh or less harsh because of that, right? And the challenge with actually making the reviewer available to the author, and this actually leads into some, is if the author knows the reviewer, then, and this happens, then they start contacting the reviewer and being like, okay, can you give me some more help? Can you actually basically edit and co-author my paper, right? And it becomes very challenging for the reviewer, or they get very critical about it, and it can get into interpersonal stuff. So the open and transparent in, well, the words being used are being used sometimes interchangeably. So let me just talk about a couple of things. So open and transparent can both refer to the idea of the review being made available, or the names of the reviewers is more the transparent, is also part of the transparent process. But I think really there's also, for transparency, is transparency around the whole process of editing. And so it's not just about review. It's not like just, okay, we're going to publish the reviews anonymously or not. It's also being transparent about the editing process. These are the reviews, and this is why the editor made the decision to reject or request a revision based on those reviewer comments. Because sometimes, as Emily said before, you get comments from reviewers that are opposite. And it's like, okay, this reviewer said this, and we're actually going to preference that because those comments are more in line with the scope and intention of our journal. But without the author knowing that, or anybody else knowing that, there'd be, if they even know that one author said reject and one said revise, and we reject, and they go, well, somebody else said revise, how come? And that's where the transparency is showing how the process works. And so review is not just being transparent about the reviews. But the challenge with that openness is, again, if you assign your name to reviews, it also can create problems around either both ways, being critical or trying to get those people to do more work than just doing the review. But there's many more issues, but I've talked enough so far. I'm sure Cameron and Emily and Abby will have something to say about that too.
I just want to add something on the open peer review. Is it's got like two different levels. One is sharing the review itself, and still I think the reviewer can remain anonymous, but the review itself can be shared publicly and linked to the article. And as Emily mentioned, a DOI can even be assigned to that review, so that can also be read as part of that process. And really, it's all part of a bigger trend of transparent science, because we're talking about the articles, the findings, we're talking about so much of the scientific work that remains hidden and is not shared. And sometimes scientific discoveries, even if it's a negative discovery, it will not get published, but it's valuable. So it's all part of a bigger movement of open science and transparent science, and that's the bigger picture. So we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, that's a great contribution, Cameron. Okay, if we're okay, I actually want to rewind just a little bit. Karin, a few minutes ago, in one of your statements, you had talked about journal editors and publishers giving guidelines and training their peer reviewers. Can we talk a little bit more about the practicality of how do journals find peer reviewers and essentially recruit them into doing the work, and how do they train them?
It's hard. So so let me start with the finding process, which is a big struggle. Journals do this in different ways. Many journals have an editorial board that is their first go-to for finding peer reviewers. And being on the editorial board means I'm agreeing to review a bunch of papers for that journal in a year. Or, but for other journals like mine, I can't keep a corpus of editorial board because we're focused on methods, I cover tons of topics, right? So I've got methodological experts and I've got some topic experts, but I cover everything in the field. And so we often end up, what we do is, in some cases, just go down to basic searches in the academic databases on the topics or the methods or the area or the focus that we're looking for that review. And so sometimes even starting with the bibliography, the list of references in the paper itself, because oftentimes those people are qualified to review. And then, but also sometimes we don't find enough. And so we actually just have to search in the literature to find somebody that we think is appropriate. And that is additionally what, as Abby said, makes it also take a lot more time. And then they don't know us and so they're skeptical about reviewing. But and then the other piece, sorry, about training is extremely difficult. We can't, no editors don't, I don't know about you, Emily, but we're not in the business of training peer reviewers. The best we can do is provide written guidance when we ask them to do the peer review. Your thoughts, Emily?
So first of all, I think for sourcing peer reviewers, another, it's something Karen and I say again and again in our journal management workshop is networking. Networking is so crucial as an editor of a journal, as a researcher in general. Go to conferences, keep an eye on who's saying what. You sit at conferences all the time for your personal interests and career development and everything. And everyone at every conference you're at is a potential peer reviewer. Every author is a potential peer reviewer in the future. And we say this again and again, Karen and I, again, it's one of the reasons you want to make sure you give every author, even the authors you don't want to publish, constructive criticism with their peer reviewers. You might need them at a later date. Sometimes at some point you might get another article in that field. Remember that author was focused on this area, even if you didn't choose to publish in the first place. So I think networking is just crucial, and general politeness. And again, regarding training, I've already mentioned briefly that we do a masterclass on journal management. Also, there are a lot of organizations that do run workshops and training sessions. We are one of them. And I think this comes back to what Karen was saying earlier about how do we improve awareness and procedural processes for peer review, and that it is it needs support on an institutional level. Not every journal can't necessarily afford to run a masterclass for its reviewers, but educational institutions should really consider doing that as a career development thing for their staff, but also for their students, because a significant portion, certainly of their postgraduate students, are going to want to go into academia. Whether or not there are always jobs available in their field is a whole other kettle of fish, but certainly it is a very useful career development offering beyond the core focus of your studies, and I think that's very valuable.
We definitely touched on a reward system for reviewers, and it's part of a bigger ecosystem. So things like this peer review week that we are part of right now, and raising the awareness, all of these are making contributions towards better reviews, better reviewers. And in general, when the system is improving and there's a reward mechanism as well, we can only see growth and see things get better and improve. So I think that we're in a trend that awareness will increase. It will become, there's actually many people already themselves find a joy in reviewing, because it's a way of also staying up to date and finding all the relevant material before it's published. Is a way of contributing towards science. But as part of this overall improvement, we can see that having a reward system, being part of that, it's just becoming more and more, I can't say serious because it's already serious, but it's getting the recognition that it really deserves. I can put it that way.
I totally agree. And I think that, like you're saying, I mean, this is developing these reward systems and mechanisms. And I'm hoping that as these ideas and mechanisms sort of work themselves out to a stronger and stable way of actually providing that recognition, that then it will go to the next level, which is where the reward is really, someday, I hope 5 years from now, when we have this conversation, that actually universities have a way of really building peer review into their tenure package evaluations. That would be a great opportunity to actually encourage it.
You're so right. I think what I want to do, I just want to synthesize a little bit too with the training. And I think it brings in points that everybody's made, you know, talking about how peer review is part of the bigger scientific movement, talking about, you know, kind of sometimes the limitations of individual journals to run master classes and things. One of the experiences that we've had as an organization in the past couple of years is actually working with government entities that support higher education in running large scale courses for multiple universities. You know, we had a government entity here in the UAE, and they sponsored a workshop, and there was 15 universities that were participants, and the subject of the workshop was best practice for peer review. How do you do good peer review? And being a part of initiatives like that is really, of course, rewarding, because you get to engage with scholars and researchers, you know, in a broader scope, but also, you know, it really is pushing that, pushing towards that more knowledgeable world, pushing towards the advancement of science and understanding, just like what Cameron said, it's like when we put value on these things, when we recognize the importance of peer review, it's good for the whole system, the whole ecosystem, I think. Cool. Okay, I want to take us in a little bit of maybe a different direction. I know we're running short on time. We've been talking now for close to 40 minutes. So I have two important questions that I want to get to before we finish. What is gatekeeping, and how are authors and reviewers affected by it?
No one's going to jump in. I can just start.
Go for it, Emily.
I think one of the ways that gatekeeping occurs is very much, you know, it's I think Karen and I have both touched on this, as well as Cameron and Abby to a lesser extent, is that when, as a journal or an editorial board, you're looking for reviewers, your first port of call is people you already know. So that can result in inadvertent gatekeeping, because we tend to know academics within our specific fields, within our specific regions. So that can, as I said, result in inadvertent gatekeeping, because we might not get the equity, you know, the sort of inclusiveness that one would like, because I might not know someone from a completely different continent in my field personally and feel confident enough to approach them. So that I think that can happen, and that impacts authors and the journals themselves, or can impact them negatively, because you're potentially excluding huge demographics with great fresh insights, whether they're in a different field or a different region or even just a different university.
I think that's so totally right. And I think that this actually touches on a very, very difficult problem but I just would like to acknowledge that it's complicated and it's messy and it's not perfect. And I think that academic publishing and the advancement of science, particularly when we think about peer review and publishing generally, in many ways, I look at the whole process and the way it works is kind of like the way we sometimes talk about democracy. Like, it's the worst system in the world, but it's better than everything else, because there's so many things that get in the way, and it's too hard. Like you're saying, Emily, okay, yes, we reach out to find peer reviewers, and it's naturally the context of what we know, although we can try and search out. But on the other hand, is there a way to do it any other way? It's extremely difficult. I mean, I don't know if there's possibilities for artificial intelligence to actually generate, you know, potential peer reviewer lists. I mean, who knows? That may be a possibility in the future. But I think
we were just asked by a client if we could provide such a thing.
Really? Oh my gosh! Wow, okay.
It's already happening. It's yeah, the AI generated recommendations. We see it for journals, so it's happening for reviewers as well.
Well, actually, you're right. I do know about that, but I also feel like it's one of those trends, and we'll see where it can go further. But also, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of gatekeeping, not just that our selections of peer reviewers are creating a very restrictive entryway to our journal. I also want to defend gatekeeping a little bit, because each journal, we have a scope for a reason. And we also make choices that are related to our scope, but also to very specific practicalities in terms of our available resources. So like peer reviewers don't get paid, and that the value of that is that they are not going to be influenced into how they say something. And many editors are not, like Emily and I are not full-time. That's not our full-time job, right? And so what that means is that we don't have, so oftentimes I can see manuscripts are submitted where I can see that the research is actually pretty solid, but the writing it makes it completely indecipherable to understand. And sometimes I even manage to get it into a condition where I can send it to review, and they come back from the reviewer after revision, and it's still impossible to understand. And ultimately, I'm making a decision to reject, not based on the methods, but sometimes I have to reject because I don't have enough time to rewrite your paper for you. And and sometimes it's just a language issue. If you're trying to publish in English and it's not your first language, it's a huge problem. And it makes me so sad when I don't have the ability to help make good research available. So sometimes though that's part of what happens, and it's messy and it's not ideal, but it's reality.
That comes back to what we've said, again in one of our workshops, is Karen and I, that having the research, I think, and the reviewer does two of these folders. The one point, they are evaluating the research, but also they are saying, okay, so even if the research is great, your argument is not convincing me. You're not framing your findings in a way that I, as the reviewer, and therefore I, as the audience, I'm going to really engage with and understand and value your research. Hence, it is that go back and do it again, and we'll look in a bit. But that's why it's something some friends and I always say that the words, like the academic equivalent of I love you, is accepted without revisions. As in, the reviewers have just said, yes, there's three little words that we all want to hear and we never really hear enough. Sam finds that really funny. But it's so true, and it's so rare, because the fact is, even the most high-level scholars themselves get peer review that says you need to change it, because it's almost like, super rare to get those lovely little words, because everyone needs to review, everyone needs to refine their arguments. And occasionally, everyone realistically needs to address those niggling little typos and formatting errors that we don't see.
So to get back to actually though, because it's also making me think, getting back to what you first said, Emily, about the challenges that we have in finding peer reviewers that are naturally within our network and our sort of purview. I also want to speak to trying to find people outside of our discipline, but also outside of our culture. So and not just our disciplinary culture, but our sort of socioeconomic, ethnic culture, because I also find, particularly in the social sciences, and maybe you can speak to how it plays out in the humanities, but in the social sciences, and actually, Abby, you're a public health person. This is a big place where this makes a difference. Public health research that happens in North America, it plays out differently if you're doing public health research in India or in Nigeria or in Indonesia. The public health environment, which involves the culture, is different. And so not only do you get different results, but you may need to use different methods and things like that. And I think that when you don't, if I have North American reviewers for Indonesian public health research, you're not going to get the kind of reviews that you want, right, Abby?
Yes, I completely agree with you on that. It's definitely, you're going to be potentially using different methods. You're going to be dealing with different populations, and particularly, it's an issue if you are doing, if it's an Indonesian research group doing research in Indonesia that's being reviewed by American or European reviewers, but it's also particularly an issue if there's a lot of research, a lot of public health research, even done in low and middle income countries, is done by researchers in, say, the US and Europe. And so then having the research done by those people and also reviewed by those people means that there isn't necessarily anyone checking, having a second check on, for example, interpretation of results, like if there's, based on the findings, the researchers interpret that particular population in Indonesia acts in a certain way or thinks in a certain way, a peer reviewer from Indonesia may be able to critique those results in a different way because they have that lived experience, may be able to point out why the interpretation is problematic. And also people from different countries, from different sort of institutions, they may also have different background knowledge on the topic, so they need to be more familiar with the literature that has been published in different countries. And so by having them as included within the peer review process, they may be able to point out that literature, provide that different perspective.
Outstanding point, because I see that a lot, is that the literature in the papers is very skewed to what their area of what they're familiar with, and certainly, you know, in their own language. Well, yeah, excellent point.
Building on that, one of the things we actually tell a lot of our journals is to make sure that they have the geographic diversity in their advisory board and their peer reviewer pool. We actually actively encourage it, not least because it's something that is noted by leading indexes. You know, it's a known problem, though not, I think, as Cameron was saying, it's about, you know, that sort of the more broader awareness and recognition of trends and issues is perhaps slightly behind on this, but it is starting to be recognized, the importance of displaying transparently the diversity of your contributors up front and center as a credibility statement for your journal, to ensure that it isn't narrow, you know, socioeconomic or geographic in its scope. Well, in the scope of its editors, obviously a journal itself probably should be very niche to ensure its USP, but that's a whole different thing.
No, I think I'm really happy that we took the conversation into this direction, because you guys essentially read my mind. My final question was around identity and diversity. I think we know that one of the broad themes of this year's peer review week is identity. And I was going to ask the question around how can the individual identities of peer reviewers promote diversity within the research community? And I don't even need to ask it, because you guys already answered the question without being prompted. So that's really groovy. What I'd like to do in order for us, oh, go ahead, Karin, I see you want to say something.
Well, I actually also wanted to take it into, I think what the theme meant was the kind of identity and diversity of cultural experiences that we talk about, but I also wanted to throw a little philosophical, you know, bonbon on the top, which is, I think there are also disciplinary and sectoral identities and diversities that you struggle with, particularly in interdisciplinary research, right? So there are people who are focused on different types of problems, but also have different priorities. So in some disciplines or cultures or sectors, the focus on outcomes and results and what are you going to do with the research in a practical way in the world is really important. For other people, the importance is, are you expanding the logic and the development of the theory or just knowledge? And in other cases, you know, it's really about what are we doing with the findings? Are we actually getting actual findings and results? And it's not as important. So for example, in my journal, it's very important that you have a problem statement, and a problem is not just a gap in the literature. The problem is, I want to know why you're doing the research and what somebody's going to do with it at the end. But that's not necessary for every type of journal or every type of research. And so I think also in terms of thinking about these reviewers, finding people from different countries and cultures, but also different disciplines, allows you to look at the way that the problem is shaped. And also, though, to be careful when you're bringing reviewers in from other disciplines, if the work is somewhat interdisciplinary, that you're providing the guidance to them to say, okay, well, don't, you know, you're an economist, don't judge this public health thing just based on the economics of it. You got to think there's sociological stuff and medicine involved here too. So, you know, be aware that you're not judging it strictly on one viewpoint.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, in order to wrap up the conversation, I just want to give us an opportunity if anybody has any final thoughts or important points that you feel like we didn't make during the conversation, any kind of concluding statements from anyone.
Do more peer review. Be a peer reviewer.
Peer review is awesome.
We need you.
That's a good conclusion statement.
Happy peer review week.
Happy peer review week. Ah, Cameron, that's such a nice way to conclude.
And thank you to everybody who did peer reviews this year, this last year, everybody who's done peer reviews. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, guys, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your contributions. And for anybody listening or watching out there, thank you so much for tuning in with us for our very first Knowledge E Speaks discussion. We'd love to connect with you and hear from you. You can always connect with Knowledge E on our different social media platforms. With that, we are signing off. We'll see you next time. And until then, let's move towards a more knowledgeable world. Bye.